In the absence of an alternative hypothesis, we would have to say it appears that something is going on. The myocarditis and pericarditis being obvious examples of things that have shown up conspicuously. But at the very least, we need to look at that data carefully and do a proper analysis, and the instinct seems to be the opposite.
Why? Why do you think that's the case?
Well, again, I think the only way to evaluate these things properly is using scientific tools, and that is my home turf, as it were. I would say we have to think in terms of hypotheses. And the problem for me is that the only hypothesis that I have heard of or thought of that explains our seeming biases is that what is driving is a desire to vaccinate as many people as possible. And the only reason to vaccinate as many people as possible seems to be that there is profit in it.
That's a huge assertion, I think, because ostensibly this is being done for the good of society.
Well, it is and it isn't a huge assertion. If one is to say, yes, this is what is taking place, then that is beyond the evidence. But to say that no other hypothesis accounts for our biases, I think is just simply a fact. Now, anybody who believes they have a different hypothesis is welcome to advance it. But let's take the most obvious example. We are currently vaccinating people who have already had COVID-19. There is no medical justification for doing that. And if you look at the CDC website, they say that the reason to do it is that we do not know how long the immunity from the disease will last. If the vaccines appeared to be harmless, then that justification would still not fly because we don't know anything about the long-term effects, but it could at least be understandable. But in the context of a significant adverse event signal, it makes no sense. We could take the large fraction of the population that has COVID and not expose them to the risks of the vaccines, and if it became apparent that the vaccines were providing immunity as the immunity from the disease itself failed, we could administer them then. That would be a medically reasonable approach. But that's not what we're doing. We're vaccinating people who do not appear to get a benefit, who seem to have an excess risk of adverse events cropping up in the aftermath. And they are not getting something special. The fact is, what they effectively got from their encounter with COVID-19 is a broader immunity than they will get from the very narrowly focused vaccines that they are now being given. So it is not as if the vaccines contain some novel information that will give them some new kind of immunity to variants or something like that. It could be that down the road, the vaccines would be altered to provide immunity to variants, but at the moment, they are effectively redundant with the natural immunity that comes from the disease.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I've been wondering about that policy. And basically you're saying that there is no medical justification that you've come across, and I know you've been searching.
I have looked. I will also say that because the chain seems to be from the CDC to the social media platforms, which then deploy the CDC's wisdom as their justification for their censorship policy, I don't think we have to look farther than what the CDC itself says. And what the CDC itself says does not add up. There's no reason to vaccinate people who've already had COVID-19 until we know that the immunity that comes from COVID-19 is failing. And there are reasons not to do it that begin with the adverse event signal in the VAERS data.
So here's another hypothesis I've heard, right? There's a lot of, as you mentioned, there's kind of nuance here, and it's maybe complicated to figure out who has what, when did they get the disease? I don't know, right? So let's make a very, very simple policy. Everyone gets vaccinated, right? And that will create the best social good. I have no idea if this is what people are thinking, but this is one thing that's been forwarded to me as an idea. It's just too complicated to try to go into all the different nuance here.
I must say I've heard that as well, but I find it shocking because to the extent that the conditions that we are seeing show up in the VAERS data are very serious, and the number of deaths is very substantial, well beyond what the stopping condition for a regular vaccine under normal conditions would be. Every time we vaccinate somebody who doesn't need it in order to simplify our policy, and they die, they are leaving a family bereft. They may be leaving a family struggling to figure out how to get by in the world. The harm done by a single death is so substantial that we cannot justify exposing people to that risk to simplify a policy. What's more, although there is ambiguity for many people on whether they have had COVID-19, part of that ambiguity is almost inexplicable. We've done a very poor job of coming up with definitive tests that would give you a good sense. That said, there are many people who have an almost unambiguous case for having had COVID-19. People who tested positive and lost their taste and smell sense, those people had COVID-19. There is no reason at all to expose them to this extra danger, and it is not substantially more complicated to say so.
You've called the mass vaccination of COVID-19 the biggest gain-of-function experiment ever. What does that mean?
Well, what we are doing is unusual. We are deploying a novel technology that contains a very, the code for a very narrow antigen signal, and we are deploying it into an active pandemic. And because the vaccines are not perfectly effective at preventing breakthrough cases, they are effectively exerting a very strong kind of selection on the virus. And there's every reason to worry that this selection will drive the evolution of escape mutants. That is to say, selection in favor of mutations that make the virus invisible to the aware immune system that has been alerted by the vaccines. And that could produce an ongoing pandemic where we might end the pandemic if we were to approach it differently.
So how is this different than in a typical situation where you would use traditional vaccines, for example?
Well, a traditional vaccine you would deploy where there was a very low chance of contact and a long-lasting immunity. And what that means is that the majority of people who would encounter the pathogen would be immune by the time they did encounter it, because the vaccine would have had time to fully develop the immunity, and there would be negligible selection in favor of escape mutants. In this case, what we have is two things. One, we have the incomplete effectiveness of the vaccines, which means that within people who have breakthrough cases, the immune system is exerting a selective pressure against variants that are easily seen and towards variants.
And just to be clear, breakthrough cases are cases where someone is vaccinated and they still get the disease. Yeah,
correct.
Just for viewers' benefit. Yeah.
But the other thing that we have, in addition to people within whom you would have this selection, is we also have people who are in the process of developing immunity because they've been vaccinated and they're perhaps between the two vaccinations, or the immune system is simply taking time to learn the lesson of the protein that is being used to train it. And those people, their incomplete immunity also constitutes an environment in which selection can cause the evolution of escape.